All right, everyone, we are looking at economics in the interwar period. That is topic 7.4. Our major focus is going to be what happened after World War I. How did the Great Depression start? And finally, what is happening throughout the world? We're looking at South America and Asia, specifically the Soviet Union and China. So, starting with the Great Depression. During World War I, the US had become the world's leading source of investment. Guys, war is very profitable if you're not fighting in it. And then, even during the war, US businesses produced materials that the government bought, continuing this buildup of the economy. In the 1920s, speculation on the US stock market had also increased dramatically until October 29th, 1929, with the crash of the stock market. Due to globalization, this would actually impact the entire world, and each country's government decided to enact policies that would protect their own economies. But again, because we're a truly global society, this made the situation as a whole considerably worse. So, looking at the US, President Franklin Roosevelt, who was in office from 1933 to 1945, implemented the New Deal. And it's a series of public works programs that were designed to lower the unemployment rate while simultaneously building up the country, building up the economy, focusing on infrastructure. You get the idea. France and Britain were able to escape the worst of the Depression because of imperialism. They forced their colonies to purchase their products. They forced their colonies only to sell to them, and then they could only buy from them. So they can essentially charge whatever they want. And yes, if you're thinking of, well, isn't that what started the American Revolution? You would be correct. That's what we're going to be looking at, guys. So when we talked about in class how World War I is the catalyst for the anti-imperialism movement, this is contributing to that. Japan and Germany also suffered considerably more. German unemployment reached twice that of Britain, and because of the reparations Germany was still making as a result of World War I, there were people who were literally starving to death in Germany because there was no food. There were no options. The economy was spiraling. In Japan, the heaviest burden fell on farmers and fishermen. Japan was still an agricultural-based economy despite their infrastructure and technology. Lower food prices also hit hardest in areas where the economies were dependent on agriculture. Countries such as Brazil, and where the entire national economy was dependent on crop exports, was hit incredibly hard. That being said, Turkey was attempting to build its industry in order to make them less dependent on foreign manufactured goods. And this actually helped them quite a bit. It is also during this time we're going to see a massive increase in technology. And what that impact was, in 1900, the world's largest 10 cities were all located in Europe. By 1950, 4 of those 10 cities were outside of Europe, and the trend would continue. The rise of huge urban centers in Asia can actually be traced back to the invention of the rickshaw. That not only transformed transportation, but it brought significant new economic opportunities within cities. Electricity spread incredibly slowly. So first we know that electricity was used for the telegraph. Morse code, communication. It wasn't until Thomas Edison created the light bulb that we actually have electric lighting. Prior to that, it's gas, it's candles. The electricity that people would install in their homes spread very slowly at first, also to businesses. And one of the most obvious impacts that we still see today, thanks to electric lighting, is the creation of the second and third shift. So factories were able to stay open 24/7. People were able to stay out later. No one's walking home with a lantern anymore. Now there are streetlights. So this actually built up businesses as more people were frequenting and staying out later. Obviously, electricity was very expensive, so only the upper class could afford it at first. And then especially outside of the West in the first part of the 20th century, electricity spread slowly. We're also going to see film, photography, and radio. That actually spread rapidly. So the images that you see, first is a still from one of the most famous movies. It's a silent film. It's called Nosferatu. I really recommend watching it. You'll probably laugh hysterically because we're going to watch it with our 21st century brains and we're going to be like, oh, this is ridiculous. This was terrifying to people when it first came out. It's the original vampire film. You can also see an image of the rickshaw. We've talked about how it transformed cities, but it had a very negative impact for the people who were pulling these. They were living in absolute poverty. With the invention of the moving pictures or movies, we'll also see the spread of what's called mass culture. The invention of a sewing machine that you could have in your home revolutionized the way people dress themselves. It revolutionized the way people were able to produce clothing, how quickly. You no longer had to go to a dressmaker, you could make it yourself. And finally, that awful contraption that you see in the lower right corner, that is the original vacuum cleaner. And I know it sounds great, but having appliances like this actually made women's lives more difficult because of appliances like the vacuum cleaner, like refrigerators, like washing machines. Women were expected to have immaculate houses, and they actually had to work harder to keep them spotless. Fun times, I know. We also have an increase in cultural and social aspects of life. So this is after World War I ends, we're going to see a rise of artistic movements. So there were more standard and less subjective ways to identify oneself, especially in the post-war years. Women in parts of the world saw rapid changes, especially in the realm of political movements. So women earning the right to vote, women campaigning for the right to vote in the US, in Great Britain. Women wouldn't get the right to vote in France until during World War I, but it would not take effect World War II, and it would not take effect until after World War II. What we're going to see, though, is an increasing amount of knowledge spreading throughout that's going to challenge old beliefs. So one will be the discovery of subatomic particles in Einstein's theory of relativity. And this undermined many of the old certainties about nature that had already been shaken by the ideas of Darwinism. We're also going to see the field of psychology and the famous Sigmund Freud, as well as sociology of Emily Durkheim, introduce notions of cultural relativism. We'll also look at existentialism. We'll look at psychological theories, different schools of psychology, and the impact that sociology would have on American society. We'll also see the rise of artists like Picasso, as well as Salvador Dali, and the emergence of movements called the Dada. And it was named so because it's ridiculous. And that's actually why they called it the Dada movement. It was the idea that art should challenge the tradition of realism and even the idea of reason in and of itself. We'll also look at technology and their impact on the environment. So, no new technology fascinated people more than the airplane. Health and hygiene were also part of this cult of modern living. Advances were made in medicine. You saw that in World War I with reconstructive surgery. That's going to continue on. We'll also see sewage treatment systems and indoor plumbing becoming the norm throughout the Western world. We'll also see an increase in the use of soap, which is great. And then the continuation of creation of home appliances. So having ovens that can be plugged in, refrigerators, freezers, more importantly so, washers and dryers. It is during this time period that we'll also see the rise of organized athletics. This is where the Olympics returns and makes a glorious comeback. 1896 is the first Olympics, and during this sporting event, people in the masses came together. Only 2 events were actually open for women. And we're going to see that throughout this period, sports become a way that people come together despite differences in religion or ethnicity. Nothing united people more than a sporting event. The skyscraper and the automobile will transform the urban environment. For one thing, guys, skyscrapers had load-bearing steel frames. Passenger elevators began flocking up in the American cities. What we're also going to see is the creation of the suburbs. And we can thank the mass-produced automobiles for that because they're going to replace horses in city streets. It's going to lead to the construction of suburban areas because people can afford to buy a mass-produced automobile. The Model T by Ford became the first one that people could buy. And they were so affordable, middle-class families could afford to buy them as well as upper-class families. And then working-class families could afford to buy used automobiles. This allowed people to leave the cities and live outside, and we're going to see a mass rise of multiple suburban areas. All right, so now we're getting into actual revolutions, guys. The 20th century revolutions compared to the 18th and 19th century revolutions. They're not based on Enlightenment ideas, but socialism and communism. The end result is not democracy. It's rather an improvement to society as a whole, in theory anyway. Leaders were still mostly intellectuals, and it was geared less to the middle class or more towards the peasants and the proletariat, as they're called. However, the revolutions tended to be considerably more violent, repressive, and use a great deal of technology. We're also going to see the rise of the US in political affairs outside of just the Americas. So in 1823, we had the Monroe Doctrine, and it's best known as the policy in the Western Hemisphere. It was delivered by President James Monroe in 1823, and it basically warned European nations that the U.S. would not tolerate further colonization or puppet monarchs. But here's what's going to happen. The U.S. would take Texas and Mexican cession, and then they would gain independence for Cuba. So the U.S. is still involved in these affairs, even though they're telling Europe, stay out of it. We're also going to have the Roosevelt corollary where the U.S. will police the Americas. So what did that actually mean? So the Monroe Doctrine is essentially passive in theory. It just asks that Europeans not increase their influence. By the 20th century, the U.S. had gained considerable power as well as confidence, and they were willing to take on the role of, and I'm using air quotes now, y'all, regional policemen. And the best example that we're going to see early on is Roosevelt growing concerned that a crisis between Venezuela and its creditors would spark a nation of invasions, essentially, is what we're looking at, guys. European powers would invade because Venezuela could not pay them back. So the Roosevelt Corollary of December 1904 stated that the U.S. would intervene as a last resort to ensure other nations in the Western Hemisphere fulfilled their obligations to international creditors. And they did not violate the rights of the U.S. or invite foreign aggression to attack the American nations. And essentially what we'll see is the U.S. increasingly using military force to restore internal stability in the region. And Roosevelt declared the U.S. might exercise international police in cases of flagrant wrongdoing. And what we'll see is the U.S. sending troops to Cuba, Haiti, Mexico, Honduras, and Nicaragua, and we'll also see them building the Panama Canal. And this has actually been referred to as Yankee imperialism. Speaking of the Panama Canal, what is it? Why do you have to know it? The Panama Canal is a lock-type canal owned and administered by the Republic of Panama. It connects the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans through the very narrow isthmus of Panama. The length from shoreline to shoreline is about 40 miles. And what we're looking at, it was completed in August of 1914, and it's one of the two most strategic artificial waterways in the world, the other being the Suez Canal. This was ordered to be built by Roosevelt. It was actually built, though, by the people of Panama. And in 1979, control of the canal passed to the Panama Canal Commission, and that's a joint agency between the U.S. and Panama. However, complete control did not pass to Panama until December 31st, 1999. So it was controlled solely by the U.S. from 1914 to 1979. So the U.S. financed this project, but it was built by the people of Panama. All right, so meanwhile, the Mexican Revolution would last from 1911 to 1928. Mariano Huerta seizes power of Mexico, and he ended up putting Madero in prison where he was murdered. We'll see a number of other leaders rising up and leading smaller rebellions against Huerta. The U.S. also got involved by occupying the cities of Veracruz, which would leave with Huerta fleeing the country. And then we'll see a change in power. So Carranza gains power in Mexico. And we're kind of going a step back. We talked about this briefly before. And the philosophy that's being followed focuses on socialism. And the reasons that people were revolting were unequal land distribution and the power of the Catholic Church within Mexico. The fact is, you have the majority of Mexicans who were being ignored by the government. The land-owning elite were the only ones who were benefiting from anything the government was doing. And this is where you get people like Emiliano Zapata and Pancho Villa rising up and fighting against the power. But part of the issue, a great deal of force and violence is used, and none of these people ever truly unite into one single rebellion. So after the Mexican Revolution ended the dictatorship of Mexico, a constitutional republic was established. And one thing we're going to be looking at is after Carranza leaves power, we have a series of rulers who don't quite keep going with the republic, with the ideas that are set up. Finally, the National Revolutionary Party is founded in 1928. Even though the republic was established in 1910, you still have a series of corrupt rulers. You have a series of ideals that are never formally enacted. So we'll have President Obregon and then his successor, Elias Calles, who will found the National Revolutionary Party. It's not until we see President Lázaro Cárdenas installed as president of Mexico that true change would actually be seen. So Cárdenas would actually focus on nationalizing Mexico for the Mexican people. And one thing he does is he removes generals from the top positions of the government. He also replaced the church-run schools with government schools, and he made education compulsory. He also removed any sort of foreign power from the oil industry as well as the land. So he actually redistributed the land, taking it from the wealthy landowners and giving it back to the peasants. The companies that had owned the oil industry in Mexico were foreign nationals, people who were essentially paying the leaders of Mexico a lot of money for this oil, and that money was never actually given back to the Mexican people. And Cardenas refused to do that, so he nationalizes it. And as you can imagine, he was well liked by the people of Mexico, but not so much by foreign investors and foreign companies. Boop. In Brazil and Argentina, at the end of the 19th century, the introduction of railroads and refrigerated carts transformed Argentina from an exporter of hides and wools to an exporter of meat, specifically where you're looking at cattle. Argentina's government focused on the interests of the oligarchia, which was a small group of wealthy landowners. The elite had little interest in anything other than farming, and they were content to let foreign companies, mainly British, build the railroad, process plants, and public utilities. Brazil's elites of coffee and cocoa planters, as well as rubber exporters, resembled the Argentine elite. They used their wealth to support a very lavish lifestyle, and they allowed the British to build railroads, harbors, and other infrastructure. But both Argentina and Brazil had small but very outspoken middle classes that demanded a share in government and looked to Europe as a model. During the 20s, peace and high prices for agriculture exports allowed both Argentina and Brazil to industrialize. But the introduction of new technology left them dependent on the advanced industrialized countries. And this is how we get Vargas in Brazil. So Getulio Vargas staged a coup, and then he followed a policy that increased import duties and promoted national firms and state-owned enterprises. But these reforms were only beneficial to urban workers, and they didn't help the landless peasants. So the benefits of this economic recovery were not equally distributed among society. And then in 1938, he staged a second coup. He abolished the Constitution and he made Brazil a fascist state. And this actually spread outside of Brazil throughout South America with the temptations of political violence. He was overthrown in a military coup in 1954. In Argentina, in 1930, General José Urburu overthrew the elected president, and this led to 13 years of rule by generals and the oligarchia. In 1943, Colonel Juan Peron led another coup, and he actually established a government that modeled itself on Hitler's Nazi regime in Germany. But as World War II turned against the Nazis, Peron and his wife Eva realized, okay, we need to change tactics. They appealed to urban workers to create a new base of support that allowed Peron to win the presidency in 1946 and established a populist dictatorship. His government sponsored rapid industrialization, and he spent a lot of money on social welfare projects that depleted the capital Argentina earned during the war. And why Ava's picture is so much larger than Juan's, a lot of people believe that even though he, in theory, ran the government, she was the mind behind the decisions being made. And this also coincides to when she died at a very young age of cancer. He was overthrown shortly thereafter. In colonial Africa, outside of Algeria, Kenya, and South Africa, few Europeans actually lived in the imperialized countries. The very small European presence dominated the African economy and developed Africa as an exporter of raw materials that brought benefits to Europeans, but very few to Africans. They were forced to work in European-owned mines and plantations under incredibly harsh conditions for little or no pay whatsoever. Colonialism provided little modern healthcare, and many colonial policies worsened public health. It undermined the African family, and it gave rise to large cities in which Africans experienced severe racial discrimination. During the colonial period, many Africans turned toward Christianity or Islam, and early nationalist leaders and movements, such as the African National Congress in South Africa and Pan-Africanists like W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey from America, had little influence until after World War II, when Africans who had served in the Allied War came back with new and radical ideas. Radio broadcasts in indigenous languages were largely confined to British West Africa in the interwar years, with most African radio content aimed instead at European colonial populations. This is going to bring us to the Silent Revolutions. That seems like a good place to stop for today because we need to have a serious discussion about the collectivization of agriculture and then moving on to the Spanish Civil War. If you have any questions, send me an email. Otherwise, have a great night, y'all.